So Mark leaves us with a mystery that cycles around to the beginning of the gospel. That wasn't good enough for the other gospel writers. Matthew, the next writer in the New Testament timeline, presents a linear vision in which we learn that the 11 disciples actually do go to the mountain in Galilee and receive the promise that Jesus will be with them always to the end of the age. The next gospel writer in the timeline is John. He has no practical interest at all. We can skip him. Then there's Luke. Luke, the last writer in the timeline, is the only one to deal with the question of why the resurrected Jesus still isn't wandering around the countryside scaring the wits out of people. When it came to people being whisked off into heaven, Luke could have turned to the Hebrew Bible's story of Elijah flying off to heaven in the whirlwind after being separated by a chariot of fire from Elisha. That story, however, precisely because it is in the Hebrew tradition, wasn't accessible to Luke's primary audience. That audience was Greco-Roman. And as we saw in the first sermon in this series, Luke drew much of his imagery from what we might call his secular tradition. Greco-Roman literature is full, actually, of heroes, even emperors, being whisked off into heaven. Luke's first readers appreciated all his little turns of phrase that reminded them of these stories. Unfortunately, as time passed, people no longer appreciated Luke's artistry. In fact, even some ancient defenders of Luke's stories claim that the Greco-Roman writers got their imagery from Luke. Anyone thinking that alternative reality began in 2017 is off the mark by centuries. Unfortunately, church leaders turned his stories into dogma, eventually started taking his work literally. The problem with this transition from story to dogma is that it transformed the gospel into a relic of the past. We now can recognize Luke's creativity because scholars have been able to rebuild his intellectual environment. And that's good, because we have a radically different understanding of what's beyond the clouds and blue sky. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, for example, is artistically beautiful, but doesn't represent reality. So rather than continuing to interpret Luke literally, we need to explore what his imagery expresses. All the gospel writers used traditions from their time to create an image of Jesus as a sort of superhero. Unlike the heroes of Greece and Rome, and unlike the emperors of Rome, Jesus exhibits positive values, the values of love and compassion. Mark and Luke, in particular, contrast Jesus' compassion with the ruthless drive for power and domination exhibited in the culture of their time. So what's new? It's a sorry state of affairs that some modern interpreters of the Gospels use them to support that same ruthless drive for power and domination. It seems to me that by having Jesus ascend into heaven, Luke told his audience that Jesus had passed from the then and there into the eternal now and everywhere. That is, they reflect the experience of Jesus' first followers by picturing him as transcendent. His capacity to influence their lives survived his death. People in any time and every place can capture Jesus' mind and live the Jesus teachings. We are called to stop staring up into the heaven of biological and physical impossibilities and to start looking at the real world around us, where injustice still scars and even kills innocent victims, and the systems of domination still rule by the misuse of power. When we learn to see Jesus as a human being, we learn to see the potential within us to live fully human lives. As an epilogue to these 3 sermons, I want to point out a gross sin resulting from a misunderstanding of the gospel. When Mark created his passion narrative, he intentionally shifted responsibility for Jesus' crucifixion from Roman authority to Judean religious authorities. He did that because he wanted to reach out to the Greco-Roman world. Now, I use the term Judean religious authorities because a growing body of evidence indicates that Judaism, as we know it, and Christianity, as we know it, developed along parallel lines over the first 5 centuries of the Common Era. Mark understood that people manipulating to have Jesus crucified were a particular group of religious leaders living in one place at a specific time in history. He had no idea that later generations would interpret him as referring to a religious tradition stretching on into the future. He'd be appalled to find that people would use his story to justify the persecution and even murder of innocent people. Anti-Semitism is a sin based on a misinterpretation of a fictional account of Jesus' death. We as Christians need to own up to this fact. We also need to stop this sin from continuing to ruin people's livelihoods and destroy people's lives. Our ancestors in faith created this monster. It's up to us to exorcise it.